Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of the earth is multiformed. Overreaching the wide horizon is the rainbow. Its hues are as various as the hues of that arch, as distinct too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon is the rainbow. How is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness, from the covenant of peace, a simile of sorrow? But as in ethics, evil is a cause of good, so, in fact, out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which are have their origins in the ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Aegeus. That of my family I will not mention. Yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy, gray, hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars, in the character of the family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses in the armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and lastly, in the very peculiar nature of the library's contents. There is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber and with its volumes, of which the latter I will say no more. Here died my mother, herein was I born, but it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it? Let's not argue the matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, of spiritual and meaning eyes, musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow too in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber was I born, thus awakening from the long night of what seemed, but was not, non-entity, into once again the furry regions of fairyland, into a place of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thought and erudition. It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I lorded my boyhood away in books, and dissipated my youth in reverie. But it is singular that as years rolled away, and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansions of my father. It is wonderful what stagnation fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total inversion took place in the character of the most commonest thought. The realities of the world affects me as visions, and as visions only, while the wild ideas of a land of dreams become in turn not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew. I, ill of health, buried in gloom. She, agile, graceful, overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine's the study of the cloister. Me, living in my own heart and addicted body and soul to the most intense and painful meditation. She roaming carelessly through life, with no thought of the shadows in her path, or the silent flight of the raven-wing hours. Berenice, I call upon her name, Berenice. And from the gray ruins of memory, 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Oh, vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her lightheartedness and joy. Oh, gorgeous yet fantastic beauty! Oh, sylph among the shrubberies of Arnhem! Oh, naiad among the fountains! And then all's mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told, a fatal disease, fell like the Simone upon her frame, and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, perverting her mind, her habits, and her character, and in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of the person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, And the victim? Where was she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primary one which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical beings of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in its nature, a species of epilepsy, not unfrequently terminating in a trance itself, trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was in most instances startlingly abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I've been told that I should call it by no appellation, my own disease grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigor, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, consists in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. And it is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear indeed that it is not possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest in which my case, the powers of meditation, busied and buried themselves, in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects in the universe. To muse for long, unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device in the margin or in the topography of a book. To become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry or upon the door. To lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire. To dream away whole days of the perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word till the sound by the dint of frequent repetition ceased to convey any idea to the mind, and to lose all sense of emotional or physical existence by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately persevered in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by the condition of the mental faculties, not, indeed, altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Let me not be misapprehended. The undue earnest and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in characters with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in by persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as one might first expect, an extreme of condition or exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dream, or enthusiast being interested in an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of the objects in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom, until at the conclusion of a daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the incognitatum or first cause of his musings entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming, through the medium of my distempered vision, a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning upon the object as the center. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the power of the mind, more particularly exercised, were, with me, as I said before, the attentive, and are, with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to irritate my disorder, partook, it will be perceived, largely in the imaginative and inconsequential nature of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I well remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian Colle Seguente, De Eplimide Birugine de Saint Ancens de Saint Austin, great work, The City of God, and Tertullian de Carne Christi, in which the paradoxical sentence, mortus est filis, crede escala ineptum, es sepultalis, resurrectus serum esque impossibile, occupied my undivided time for many weeks of absolute and fruitless investigation. Thus, it will appear that from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that of the ocean crag spoken of by Ptolemy Hephaestion, which steadily resisting the attacks of human violence, and the fury of the waters and the winds, trembled only to the flower called asphodel. And although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady and the moral condition of Berenice would not afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose power I have been at trouble in explaining, yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmary, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently and bitterly upon the wonder, working by means which such a strange revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasy of my disease, and such of what occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder reveled in the less important but more startling changes brought in the physical frame of Berenice, in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions were always through the mind. Through the gray of the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest at noonday, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as the living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as a being of the earth, earthly, but as the abstraction of such a being, not a thing to admire, but to analyze, not as object of love, but as a theme in the most abstruse though desultory speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach, yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and oscillate condition. I called to my mind that she loved me long, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials were approaching, when upon a winter in the afternoon, one of the unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days which are the nurse of the beautiful Hylason, in the inner apartment of the library, but a lift of my eyes, I see Berenice stood before me. For as Jove during the winter season gives twice 7 days warm, men have called this climate and temperate time the nurse of the beautiful Hylason. Was it my own excited imagination, or the misty influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the gray draperies which fell around her figure that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word. And me, for words, I could not utter a syllable. An icy chill ran through my vein, and a sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time, breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon her face. The forehead was high and very pale and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it and overshadowed the hollow temples with innumerable ringlets, now of a vivid yellow, and jarring discordantly in the fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless, lustless, seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glossy stare to the contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted in a smile of particular meaning. The teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God I never beheld them, or having done so I would die. The shutting of a door disturbed me. In looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the disordered chambers of my mind, though had not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away. The white and ghastly spectrum of her teeth not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges. But what that period of her smile has sufficed to brand in upon my memory. I saw them now even more unequivocally than before. The teeth, the teeth. They were here, they were there, and they were everywhere, visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing about them as in the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania. I struggled in vain against this terrible and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world, I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all interests become absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone, were present to the mental eye, and they, in the sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every aptitude. I surveyed the characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them an imagination, a sensitive and sentient power, and even when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. Amadou Cello, it'd be well said que tu, c'est pas aider seminete in of Berenice. I more seriously believe que tas de elementes te estas deastos. Ah, here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me. And therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt their position alone could restore me to peace and give me back reason. And the evening closed upon me thus, and then darkness came and tarried and went, and the day again dawned, and the mists of a second night were gathering around, and still I lay motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation. The phantasm of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy as with the most vivid, hideous distinctiveness. It floated amongst the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry of horror and dismay, and there, after that, succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingled with low moanings of sorrow or of pain. I arose from my seat, and throwing open one of the doors of the library, saw standing out there was a maiden chamber, a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She had been seized by epilepsy in the early morning, and at the closing in of the night, the grave was ready for the tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library again, sitting there alone. It seems I'd just woken up from a confused and exciting dream. I knew it was midnight, and I was well aware since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory was replete with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terrible, more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I strived to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing on my ears. I had done it. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside the lamp burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before. These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the singular but simple ones of the poet Ibn Zayed. Decibon mi saudele se sepulocum amace visiterium curis mi alquanete vor levatis. Why then, as I perused them, did the hairs on my head erect themselves on the end, and blood of my body become congealed within my veins? There came a light tap at the library door. Pale as the tenant of a tomb, A menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice trembling, husky, and low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the households in search of the direction of the sound. And then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impression of human nails. He directed my attention to some object on the wall, which I looked at for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grabbed the box that lay upon it, but I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces. And from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white, and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor.